A hopeful evening turned nightmare. Jason Thompson, a newly appointed police captain, had only recently moved with his wife, Emma, to the city of Millwood. It was a town that appeared picturesque on the surface, with sprawling parks, friendly neighbors, and a vibrant community. But as the couple would soon discover, beneath the surface, there was a darker undercurrent, one that would confront them head-on on what began as a simple, hopeful evening stroll. The couple was eager to explore their new home. Millwood had a charm that both Jason and Emma found irresistible. Tree-lined streets, family-owned bakeries, and children playing in every corner. They had recently left behind the hectic pace of the big city, hoping to settle down in a quieter environment. For Jason, this was more than just a career move. As a black man rising through the ranks of the police force, becoming a captain in Millwood was a testament to his perseverance. Emma, a schoolteacher, had supported him every step of the way. This move symbolized a fresh start, a chapter free from the challenges they had faced in the past. The golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk as they wandered hand in hand through the park. The scent of blooming flowers filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. It was the kind of evening that felt almost magical, perfect for reflection, laughter, and dreaming about the future. Emma gazed up at the sky, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Look at that sunset, Jay. It's beautiful, isn't it? This feels like the start of something great." Jason smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Yeah, it does. We've come a long way, haven't we?" He felt a deep sense of contentment. They had weathered storms together, his grueling work hours, the pressures of his role, the quiet but persistent challenges of navigating a predominantly white police department. Yet, here they were, stronger than ever. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. As they walked deeper into the park, the vibrant sounds of the city seemed to fade. The soft rustling of leaves overhead and the distant laughter of children created a serene backdrop. Jason was lost in thought, his mind turning to his new position. He had big plans for Millwood's police department. He wanted to foster change, to create a system that was transparent, just, and fair to all its citizens, regardless of race or background. He had worked his entire career for this, and Millwood seemed like the place where those dreams could take root. But as they ventured further into the park, something changed. The air seemed to grow heavier, the cheerful atmosphere replaced by a strange sense of foreboding. Emma noticed it first. Her grip on Jason's hand tightened as they passed beneath a flickering street lamp, its light casting eerie, elongated shadows. "Jay, something feels off." Jason nodded subtly, his senses sharpening. Years of police work had trained him to detect even the slightest shift in atmosphere. He glanced around, noticing two figures approaching from the opposite direction. Dressed in dark uniforms, the men moved with an air of authority that was all too familiar. "Stay close to me," Jason murmured to Emma, his voice calm but firm. As the two officers drew nearer, their expressions shifted from neutral to something more hostile. Their eyes narrowed, and they exchanged a look that sent a chill down Jason's spine. He knew that look. He had seen it too many times before, prejudice disguised as professionalism. "Evening," one of the officers said, his tone cold and accusatory. "What are you two doing here?" Jason resisted the urge to bristle. He knew how these encounters worked. Despite his rank, despite his uniform, he had been in situations like this before. Too many times, his skin color had been enough to cast suspicion. He tried to de-escalate, keeping his tone even. "We're just taking a walk," Jason replied, maintaining eye contact with the officer. "It's a nice evening." The second officer scoffed, his hand resting on the baton at his side. "A walk, huh? You two seem a little out of place for this neighborhood." Emma's heart raced, her mind reeling. Out of place. What did that even mean? They were just a couple enjoying a quiet evening in a public park. She glanced at Jason, her fear mirrored in his eyes, though his expression remained composed. "Excuse me." Emma spoke up, her voice trembling slightly but filled with determination. "We're just—" "Step back, lady," the first officer barked, cutting her off. "You don't want to cause trouble." The tension thickened, wrapping around them like a vice. Jason could feel his pulse quicken, the familiar surge of adrenaline coursing through him. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Years of training had prepared him for confrontations, but this was different. This wasn't just about control or protocol. This was about survival. "Look," Jason said, stepping forward to shield Emma. "We're not looking for any trouble. We're just out for a walk." The second officer sneered, his eyes glinting with a dangerous mix of contempt and power. "Is that so? Funny. You two look like you're up to no good." Emma gasped softly as the officer's words hung in the air. She could see the situation escalating, the officer's body language shifting from suspicion to aggression. They weren't just questioning them, they were provoking them. Her mind raced as she tried to think of what to say, what to do, to defuse the situation. But before she could open her mouth, one of the officers made a move. Without warning, the first officer lunged at Jason, shoving him hard. Jason stumbled backward, his breath knocked from his lungs as he tried to steady himself. Emma screamed, rushing toward him, but the second officer blocked her path, his hand gripping her arm with brutal force. "Don't touch her," Jason roared, his voice filled with a mix of rage and desperation. But it was too late. The officers had crossed a line, and the situation was spiraling out of control faster than Jason could have anticipated. Emma's eyes filled with tears, the pain from the officer's grip sending shockwaves through her body. In that moment, Jason knew he couldn't hold back any longer. "Enough," Jason shouted, his voice booming with authority. The officers paused, startled by the sudden shift in tone. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from the man they had pegged as just another powerless black man. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Jason was not just any man. He was the new police captain of Millwood, and he was done being pushed around. The next few moments hung in the balance, the park suddenly eerily silent as the weight of Jason's words settled over the scene. Emma, cradling her injured arm, looked up at him with a mixture of awe and fear. Would the officers back down, or had things already gone too far? The night, once filled with hope and promise, was rapidly descending into a nightmare that Jason and Emma were only just beginning to navigate. The hidden truth emerges. The silence that followed Jason's forceful command hung heavy in the air, a thick, palpable tension stretching between the four of them. Jason stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest, but his gaze remained locked on the officers. Emma was still on the ground, cradling her arm, her wide eyes filled with both pain and disbelief. She had never seen Jason so determined, so raw in his defense of her. And himself. The first officer, the one who had shoved Jason, narrowed his eyes. His hand instinctively rested on his baton, gripping it tightly, as if trying to assert control over the situation. For a brief moment, his aggressive facade flickered. Jason's authoritative tone had caught him off guard, but the officer quickly masked his surprise with a sneer. "What did you just say?" the officer asked, his voice low and dangerous, as if daring Jason to repeat himself. His eyes flicked over Jason, sizing him up again, this time with more caution. "I said, enough," Jason repeated, his voice firm and unwavering. He straightened his shoulders, the weight of his position filling his posture with authority. "I'm the captain of the Millwood Police Department, and I won't tolerate this kind of behavior from my officers." The second officer, who had been holding Emma, released her arm abruptly, his face paling as Jason's words sank in. He exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with his partner. The sneer on the first officer's face faltered, confusion flashing in his eyes. This wasn't what they had expected. To them, Jason had been just another black man in the park, someone they thought they could intimidate, harass, and dismiss without consequence. "Captain," the second officer muttered under his breath, disbelief coloring his tone. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his baton as he reevaluated the situation. Jason's heart raced, adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He could feel the shift in power, the uncertainty creeping into the officer's demeanor. But he also knew that their fear of being reprimanded might not be enough to de-escalate the situation completely. These were men accustomed to using their authority as a weapon, and Jason had just stripped them of that power. Now, the question was how they would react. Emma, still cradling her injured arm, struggled to her feet, her knees shaking. She placed a trembling hand on Jason's back, drawing strength from his unshakable presence. She could feel the raw tension in his muscles, the tightness in his stance as he braced for whatever came next. "Is that true?" the second officer asked, his voice now quieter, tinged with uncertainty. His eyes flickered between Jason and his partner, waiting for a cue on how to proceed. Jason locked eyes with him, his gaze steely and uncompromising. "Yes, it's true. I was appointed captain of Millwood's police force just 2 weeks ago, and I'm appalled that this is the way my officers conduct themselves in my absence." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The officers exchanged another uneasy glance, their bravado rapidly eroding. The first officer, however, wasn't ready to let go of the control he thought he had. His face twisted into a grimace of anger and disbelief. "You're lying," he spat, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "You're just trying to get out of trouble. You think pulling rank will scare us. You don't belong here." Jason's temper flared, but he kept it in check. He knew that any sign of aggression from him could be twisted, used against him later. These men were not just confronting him. They were challenging the very authority he represented, and Jason knew he had to stay composed, for both his and Emma's sake. "I'm not lying," Jason said, his voice dangerously calm. "And if you don't believe me, you can call Chief Bryant right now. He'll confirm it." The mention of the chief's name sent a ripple of unease through the officers. Jason could see the gears turning in their heads, the realization that they had possibly made a career-altering mistake. Still, the first officer hesitated, his pride wounded, and his authority undermined. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, not in front of his partner, and certainly not in front of a black man he had tried to humiliate. "I don't care if you're the president," the first officer snapped, taking a step forward. "You don't talk to me like that." Before Jason could respond, Emma interjected, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "He's not lying," she said, stepping closer to Jason, her chin lifted in defiance despite the pain radiating through her arm. "You've assaulted us for no reason. We were just walking. You have no right to treat us like this." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jason could feel the tension in the officers' postures. The first officer's jaw clenched, his face flushing with anger, but the second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly conflicted. He took a small step back, as though distancing himself from the escalating situation. Jason seized the moment. "This ends now," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "If you don't want to face disciplinary action, I suggest you walk away and reconsider how you approach situations like this in the future." The first officer glared at him, his fists clenching and unclenching as he battled his own ego. His eyes darted to his partner, who gave a subtle shake of his head, as if to say, "Let it go." With a low growl, the first officer spat at the ground near Jason's feet. "You think you're special because of that badge? You think you can change anything around here?" Jason stared him down, his voice measured. "Yes, I do. And you've just proven why change is necessary." For a moment, the officer looked like he might lash out again, his face twisted in frustration. But then, with a frustrated snarl, he turned and stormed off, his partner quickly following behind him. The night air, thick with tension moments before, seemed to ease as the two officers disappeared into the shadows of the park. Jason let out a long breath, his muscles finally relaxing as the adrenaline began to drain from his system. He turned to Emma, who was visibly shaken but holding herself together. He reached for her, gently placing a hand on her back. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, concern filling his voice. Emma nodded, though her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "I'm okay," she whispered. "But Jason, what if they don't stop? What if this keeps happening?" Jason's heart clenched at her words. He had seen the damage done by corrupt officers, the deep-rooted prejudice that festered within certain parts of the police force. He had spent his career trying to rise above it, to change things from the inside. But now, facing it so personally, he realized just how monumental the task ahead of him was. "I don't know," Jason admitted quietly, his gaze drifting to the darkened path where the officers had disappeared. "But I do know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it stops. Not just for us, but for everyone." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and fear. "You've already made a difference tonight," she said softly. "You stood up to them. You showed them that they can't treat people like this." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a start," he said, "but we got a long way to go." Together, they stood in the park for a moment longer, the weight of the evening settling over them. The warm, hopeful glow that had marked the start of their walk was long gone, replaced by a stark awareness of the challenges they faced. Jason's mind was racing. He would need to file a report, contact Chief Bryant, and ensure that those officers were held accountable. But even more than that, he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. As they slowly made their way back home, Emma leaned into him, her hand still trembling slightly. "I'm proud of you, Jay," she whispered. "I'm scared, but I'm proud." Jason's chest tightened at her words. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We'll get through this," he promised. "We'll fight back together." The night air felt colder now, the distant sounds of the city fading into the background as they walked in silence. Jason's thoughts were already shifting to what lay ahead. This wasn't just about that night in the park. This was about a system that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, a system that he was now a part of. But as they reached their home and stepped inside, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was far from over. And deep down, he knew that the next battle would be even more difficult than the one they had just faced. Confronting the system. The morning after the incident in the park, Jason woke to a heavy sense of dread weighing down on him. The previous night's events still clung to his mind like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over what should have been a fresh start in Millwood. He lay in bed for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his thoughts running wild with questions. How could things have escalated so quickly? How many other people had endured similar experiences? And most pressing of all, what was he going to do about it? Beside him, Emma stirred. Her arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and though she hadn't said much the night before, Jason could see the toll the incident had taken on her. Her usually bright, resilient spirit seemed dimmed, as if the weight of their encounter with the officers had drained her. "Hey," Jason whispered, turning toward her and brushing a strand of hair from her face. "How are you feeling?" Emma opened her eyes, and though she tried to offer a reassuring smile, it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm okay," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from the emotions of the night before. "Just a little sore." Jason's chest tightened as he looked at her. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I never thought." "Don't," Emma interrupted, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "Don't apologize. None of this was your fault. You did everything you could, and you stood up to them. That's what matters." Jason nodded, but the guilt lingered. He had dedicated his life to the police force, believing that from within, he could be part of the change the system desperately needed. But last night had shown him just how deep the rot went, how little his position truly protected him and those he loved. "I need to report this," Jason said, sitting up in bed. "We need to hold those officers accountable. They can't get away with what they did." Emma sat up beside him, her expression serious. "You're right. But do you think they'll listen? I mean, those officers didn't seem like they were worried about consequences." Jason hesitated. It was a question he had been grappling with since the moment they had walked away from the park. As captain, he had authority, but the culture of the department, like so many others, was entrenched in loyalty and silence. Officers protected their own, often at the expense of the very people they were sworn to protect. Still, Jason couldn't stand by and do nothing. "I have to try it," he said, more to himself than to Emma. "If I don't report this, it sends a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. And it's not." Emma nodded, though Jason could see the worry in her eyes. "Just be careful, Jay," she said softly. "I know how much this means to you, but they might not take kindly to you going after your own." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew Emma was right. He had seen it before, officers closing ranks to protect one another, punishing those who dared to challenge the status quo. But he wasn't just any officer. He was their captain now, and he had to believe that he could make a difference. After breakfast, Jason made his way to the police station. The walk felt longer than usual, each step weighed down by the gravity of what he was about to do. The station loomed ahead, an imposing structure of concrete and glass that seemed more like a fortress than a place of justice. Jason had walked through those doors many times before, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just walking in as an officer. He was walking in as someone who was about to challenge the very institution he had sworn to uphold. As he entered the station, he was greeted by the usual bustle of officers going about their duties. Some nodded in his direction, offering polite smiles, but there was a tension in the air that Jason couldn't ignore. Word had already begun to spread about the altercation in the park. He could feel it in the way some officers averted their gaze, the way others whispered in hushed tones as he passed. Jason headed straight for Chief Bryant's office. The chief was a grizzled veteran of the force, a man who had spent decades rising through the ranks. He was respected by many, but Jason knew that respect came with a certain level of fear. Bryant was old school, a no-nonsense leader who didn't tolerate insubordination. Jason wasn't sure how he would react to the news, but he had no choice but to find out. Jason knocked on the door, and after a moment, a gruff voice called out, "Come in." He stepped inside, finding Chief Bryant sitting behind his large wooden desk, a pile of paperwork in front of him. The chief glanced up, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he took in Jason's expression. "Captain Thompson," Bryant said, leaning back in his chair, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Jason took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Chief, I need to report an incident that happened last night." Bryant raised an eyebrow, motioning for Jason to sit. "Go on." Jason sat down, his hands resting on his knees as he recounted the events of the previous night. He explained how he and Emma had been out for a walk, how they had been confronted by two officers, and how the situation had quickly escalated into violence. He left nothing out, detailing the officers' aggression, their racial profiling, and the physical assault on Emma. As he spoke, Jason watched Chief Bryant's expression carefully. At first, the chief's face remained neutral, his gaze focused on Jason with an intensity that made it hard to gauge his reaction. But as the story unfolded, Bryant's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. When Jason finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Bryant leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he stared at Jason with a hard, scrutinizing gaze. "You're telling me," Bryant began slowly, "that two of our own officers attacked you and your wife, without provocation?" "Yes, sir," Jason replied, his voice steady but firm. "It was unprovoked. They saw us walking through the park and assumed we didn't belong." Bryant's eyes narrowed further, and Jason could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was weighing the implications of what Jason had just told him. Two officers attacking their own captain and his wife. It was a nightmare scenario for any department, especially one that prided itself on maintaining a clean image. "And you're sure about this?" Bryant asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Positive," Jason said. "Emma was injured. I had to step in to stop the situation from escalating even further." Bryant let out a slow, measured breath, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "This is a serious accusation, Thompson. You know how this is going to look, right?" Jason nodded. "I do. But that doesn't change what happened. We need to hold those officers accountable." Bryant leaned back in his chair again, his gaze drifting to the window as he mulled over his options. Jason could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken conflict hanging between them. This wasn't just about punishing two rogue officers. It was about maintaining the department's reputation, about navigating the political fallout that would inevitably follow. Finally, Bryant turned back to Jason, his eyes hard. "I'll look into it," he said, his voice clipped. "But you know as well as I do that this is going to cause problems. Internal investigations don't just disappear quietly." "I'm not asking for it to disappear," Jason replied, his voice unwavering. "I'm asking for justice." Bryant stared at him for a moment longer, and Jason could see the calculation in his eyes. Finally, the chief nodded slowly, though the tension in his posture didn't dissipate. "All right, Captain," Bryant said, his tone formal. "I'll start the investigation, but I'm going to need you to keep this quiet for now. Let me handle it." Jason hesitated. He understood the chief's position. Keeping the situation under control was paramount. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the possibility that this investigation might be swept under the rug, especially if it threatened the department's image. "I'll stay quiet for now," Jason agreed reluctantly. "But I want regular updates, and I want those officers off the street until the investigation is complete." Bryant's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he nodded. "Fair enough." Jason stood, giving a respectful nod to the chief before turning to leave. As he reached the door, Bryant's voice stopped him. "Thompson," the chief called, "watch your back. Not everyone's going to be happy about this." Jason paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob. He had expected as much, but hearing it from Bryant confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just about two officers. It was about a system that would resist change at every turn. "I know," Jason said quietly before stepping out of the office. As he walked through the station, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. He knew what he was up against, a system that was slow to change, one that had been built on a foundation of loyalty and silence. But he also knew that he couldn't back down now. If he did, he would be failing not just himself and Emma, but everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of injustice. When Jason returned home, Emma was waiting for him, her face etched with worry. She stood up as soon as he walked through the door, her eyes searching his face for answers. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice tentative. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Bryant's going to open an investigation, but it's going to be tough. He wants to keep it quiet for now." Emma frowned, her worry deepening. "Do you think he'll actually do something, or is he just trying to make it go away?" Jason shook his head, unsure. "I don't know, but I'll make sure he doesn't sweep it under the rug. We can't let this slide, Em. Not after what happened." Emma nodded, though Jason could see the doubt in her eyes. "Just be careful," she said softly. "I don't want you to get hurt." Jason wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I will. We'll get through this." As they stood together, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult fight. The system he had sworn to protect was the same system that now threatened to swallow him whole. But he wasn't going to let it. Not this time. The struggle against silence. The days following Jason's meeting with Chief Bryant felt like an eternity. The investigation had been set in motion, but there was no sign of progress. Jason knew that the gears of bureaucracy turned slowly, but the silence from Bryant and the department left him on edge. Each passing day made him wonder if the investigation was truly happening, or if it was being deliberately stalled, swept under the rug to preserve the fragile status quo. Meanwhile, Emma was recovering physically, but emotionally, the scars from the night in the park were more difficult to heal. She tried to put on a brave face, but Jason could see the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the way her eyes darted nervously whenever they were out in public. She had become more withdrawn, quieter, and the vivacious, confident woman he knew seemed to fade a little more each day. Jason couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand the waiting, the wondering, the fear that nothing would change. And as the days passed with no updates from Bryant, Jason's frustration grew into anger. He had hoped that by reporting the incident, the system would respond as it should. But now he was beginning to realize that the system wasn't just slow. It was resistant. Resistant to change, to accountability, to justice. One evening, about a week after the incident, Jason sat at the kitchen table with Emma, their dinner plates untouched in front of them. The silence between them was heavy, a reflection of the tension that had been building for days. "I can't keep waiting like this," Jason finally said, his voice low but firm. "I need to know what's happening with the investigation." Emma looked up from her plate, her eyes filled with concern. "I know, Jay, but what if pushing too hard makes things worse?" Jason clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Worse than what? Worse than letting those officers get away with what they did. Worse than letting them keep doing it to other people. Emma winced at the intensity in his voice, but didn't back down. "I just don't want you to get hurt. I've seen what happens when people challenge the system. It's not always pretty." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right to be worried. But he couldn't sit by and do nothing. He had seen too much, experienced too much to just let this slide. "I won't get hurt," Jason said, though even he wasn't sure how true that was. "But I can't stay silent, Emma. If I do, they win. And that's not something I can live with." Emma nodded, though her worry remained etched in her expression. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Jason said, leaning across the table to take her hand. "But I need to take this fight to the next level." The next morning, Jason made his decision. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for an update from Chief Bryant. If the system wasn't going to work for him, then he was going to work around it. He had allies in the department, officers who shared his vision for a fair and just police force, who were as disgusted by the actions of corrupt colleagues as he was. He needed to rally them, to gather support from those who believed in the same principles of justice that he did. Jason spent the next few days reaching out to his most trusted colleagues, those he knew wouldn't shy away from difficult conversations. Some were hesitant, concerned about the repercussions of going against the grain, but others, like Officer Rebecca Vaughn, a seasoned detective known for her unyielding integrity, were more than ready to stand with him. Vaughn had been with the Millwood Police Department for nearly 2 decades, and over the years, she had earned a reputation for being tough but fair. She had seen the best and the worst of the force, and though she had become somewhat disillusioned by the systemic issues she had witnessed, she hadn't given up on the idea that change was possible. The two met in a quiet corner of a local cafe, far from the prying eyes of the department. Jason had always respected Vaughn's judgment, and he knew that if he could get her on board, others would follow. Vaughn stirred her coffee thoughtfully as Jason recounted the events of the park, her eyes narrowing in disgust when he told her about the officer's actions. "This isn't the first time I've heard of something like this happening," Vaughn said quietly, shaking her head. "Racial profiling, excessive force. It's been happening for years, but no one's willing to put their neck on the line to stop it. Too many people in the department care more about protecting their own than doing the right thing." Jason nodded, though the admission made his stomach turn. "I can't let that continue. We need to take a stand, Vaughn. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment." Vaughn took a long sip of her coffee, her sharp eyes meeting his over the rim of her cup. "You're playing a dangerous game, Thompson. You know how this works. You go up against the wrong people, and they'll come after you." Jason leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know. But if we don't do something now, when will it stop? I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for the community, for people like Emma, who are afraid to walk down the street without being harassed by the people who are supposed to protect them." Vaughn set her cup down and leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. Most captains would have swept this under the rug and moved on. But you're talking about shaking things up in a way that's going to rattle a lot of cages. You ready for that?" Jason didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. I don't want to live in a world where I have to choose between my job and doing what's right." Vaughn studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right. I'm with you. But you're going to need more than just me if you're serious about this. We'll need to bring in other officers, people we can trust, and we'll need the community on our side. Public pressure is the only thing that's going to keep this from being buried." Jason nodded, grateful for her support. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need to make this public. We can't let the department sweep this under the rug." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about going to the press, aren't you?" Jason hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, if we can't get accountability from within the system. Then we'll have to go outside of it." Vaughn didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked almost relieved, as if she had been waiting for Jason to say those very words. "Good. I know a reporter at the Millwood Gazette who's been investigating police misconduct for years. She's been waiting for a story like this to break." Jason felt a surge of determination. This was it. The moment where they could finally expose the corruption that had been festering within the department for far too long. "Let's do it," he said firmly. "Let's make sure the truth comes out." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Vaughn arranged a meeting with the reporter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Clara Daniels. Clara had been covering the city's crime and justice beat for years, and she had built a reputation as a relentless investigative journalist. When Vaughn told her what had happened, Clara's eyes lit up with the kind of fierce determination that Jason recognized in himself. "This is exactly the kind of story we need," Clara said, scribbling notes furiously as Jason recounted the events of the park. "The public needs to know what's happening behind closed doors at the Millwood Police Department. But you understand what this means, right? Once this goes public, there's no going back." Jason nodded, his mind already made up. "I understand. But this needs to be done." Clara smiled, her eyes glinting with a mixture of excitement and respect. "You're braver than most. I've had officers talk to me before, but they always back out at the last minute, too scared of the consequences. But if you're ready to go through with this, I'll make sure your story is heard." Over the next few days, Clara worked tirelessly, gathering information and interviewing other officers who were willing to speak out, officers who had seen misconduct but had been too afraid to report it. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the story began to fall into place. The more Clara uncovered, the more Jason realized just how deep the corruption went. This wasn't just about two rogue officers. It was about a culture of impunity that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for years. But even as the momentum grew, so did the pressure. Jason began to notice the way some of his colleagues looked at him with suspicion, the way conversations would fall silent when he walked into the room. It was clear that word had spread about what he was doing, and not everyone was pleased. The resistance within the department was growing, and Jason knew it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. One afternoon, as Jason was leaving the station, he was approached by Sergeant Bill Horton, a gruff, burly man who had been with the force for over 30 years. Horton had a reputation for being tough, but fair, or at least, that's what most people thought. Jason had always suspected that Horton was part of the old guard that resisted any kind of reform, and now, as Horton stepped in front of him, blocking his path, Jason's suspicions were confirmed. "Thompson," Horton growled, his voice low and menacing. "I've been hearing things. You've been talking to the press." Jason didn't flinch. "I'm doing what needs to be done. We can't keep covering up misconduct." Horton's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jason thought the older man might actually strike him. But instead, Horton leaned in closer, his breath hot and foul. "You think you're a hero, don't you? Think you're gonna clean up this department? Let me tell you something, boy, you're out of your depth. You've got no idea how things work around here." Jason met Horton's gaze, unflinching. I know exactly how things work. And that's why I'm doing this. The system is broken, and I'm going to fix it. Horton let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. Fix it? You're gonna get yourself and everyone around you crushed. You think these people care about justice. They care about power, and you're threatening that. You're in for a rude awakening, Captain. Jason stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his resolve firm. Maybe I am, but I'm not going to stop. Horton stared at him for a long moment, his expression hard and unreadable. Then, with a grunt, he stepped aside, letting Jason pass. But the warning was clear. As Jason walked away, his mind raced. Horton's words echoed in his ears, but they only served to strengthen his resolve. This was the battle he had signed up for, and he wasn't going to back down. That night, as he sat with Emma, Jason told her about the confrontation with Horton. Emma's face paled, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're in dangerous territory, Jay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you." Jason looked into her eyes, feeling the weight of her fear, but also the strength of her love. "You won't lose me," he promised. "But I have to do this. For us. For the people who can't fight back. I can't turn away now." Emma nodded, though her worry remained. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Jason said, though he knew that the road ahead would only get more treacherous. The storm breaks. The days following Sergeant Horton's warning were fraught with tension. Jason knew that he had crossed an invisible line, one that separated the officers who turned a blind eye to corruption from those willing to fight against it. And now, the storm was gathering around him, the winds of resistance blowing stronger with each passing day. The atmosphere in the station had shifted dramatically. Where once there were polite nods and casual conversations, there were now cold stares and whispers behind Jason's back. Officers who had once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact, their loyalty to the old ways keeping them at a distance. Jason had expected this. He knew the risks involved when he decided to speak out, but knowing didn't make it any easier. Emma had noticed the strain too. Though she tried to hide it, Jason could see the worry etched into the lines of her face. She had always been his anchor, his support, but now the burden of what they were facing was taking its toll on her as well. "Jay, you haven't been sleeping," Emma said one morning as they sat together in the kitchen, her voice soft but filled with concern. "I can see it in your eyes. This is wearing you down." Jason rubbed his face, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I can't stop now. The story's about to go public. Clara says she's almost ready to publish." Emma frowned, her hands tightening around her coffee mug. "And what happens when it does? You know they're going to come after you, right? The department, the media, maybe even worse." Jason sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had thought about that, about the repercussions that would follow once the truth came out. But every time he considered stepping back, the memory of that night in the park came flooding back, along with the countless stories he had heard from people who had been mistreated, ignored, or abused by the very system meant to protect them. "I know," Jason said quietly, "but this isn't just about me. If I stay silent, I'm complicit, and I can't live with that." Emma reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I know you can't, and that's why I'm with you, no matter what happens. Just be careful, okay?" Jason squeezed her hand, offering her a small, weary smile. "I will." The day the story broke, Jason felt the world tilt on its axis. Clara Daniels had done her homework, and the article in the Millwood Gazette was nothing short of explosive. The headline was bold, unflinching. "Corruption in the ranks. Millwood Police Department faces racial profiling and misconduct allegations." The article detailed everything: the incident in the park, the aggressive behavior of the officers, and the larger systemic issues within the department that had allowed this kind of misconduct to go unchecked for so long. Clara had interviewed not only Jason but other officers who had witnessed similar incidents over the years, as well as community members who had long felt targeted by the police. The story painted a damning picture of the department, and by the time Jason finished reading it, he knew there would be no turning back. The reaction was immediate. Within hours of the article's publication, social media was ablaze with outrage. Activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens rallied behind the story, demanding answers and calling for reform. Hashtags like #JusticeForEmma and #ReformMillwoodPD trended as people shared their own stories of police harassment and discrimination. But while the public seemed to embrace the call for accountability, the response inside the department was far more hostile. When Jason arrived at the station that morning, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers eyed him with open hostility, their whispers no longer hushed. He could hear snatches of conversations as he walked down the hall. "Traitor. Can't believe he turned on us. He's gonna get what's coming to him." Jason kept his head high, refusing to show any sign of weakness. He had known this would happen. He had known that by going public, he was putting himself in the crosshairs of the very people he worked with. But he wasn't going to back down. As he made his way to his office, he was stopped by Sergeant Horton, his hulking figure blocking the hallway. "Thompson," Horton growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You really think airing our dirty laundry in public is gonna solve anything?" Jason met Horton's glare, his face impassive. "It's the only way anything's going to change. The public deserves to know what's happening in their own police department." Horton's eyes narrowed, his lip curling in disgust. "You think you're a hero. You think you're gonna clean this place up. You're a fool, and you've made a lot of enemies, Captain. This isn't gonna end well for you." Jason stepped forward, standing toe-to-toe with the sergeant. "Maybe. But I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for everyone who's been mistreated by this department, and I won't stop until there's real accountability." Horton's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. For a moment, Jason thought the older man might actually hit him. But instead, Horton stepped back, his eyes flashing with contempt. "You just signed your own death warrant, Thompson," Horton said, his voice dripping with malice. "Watch your back." With that, Horton stormed off, leaving Jason standing alone in the hallway. The threat hung in the air, but Jason didn't flinch. He had expected this kind of reaction. What mattered now was what happened next. Later that day, Jason was called into Chief Bryant's office. As he entered, the tension in the room was palpable. Chief Bryant sat behind his desk, his expression grim, while a few other high-ranking officers stood off to the side, their faces tight with anger and disapproval. "Captain Thompson," Bryant said, his voice clipped. "Sit down." Jason sat, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, but he kept his expression neutral. "You've made quite a mess," Bryant said, leaning back in his chair. "This article, it's causing a lot of problems for the department. You went public without consulting me, without following protocol. Do you have any idea what kind of damage this is doing?" Jason met Bryant's gaze, his voice steady. "The damage was already done. I reported the incident to you, Chief. I waited for action, and nothing happened. This was the only way to ensure that those officers were held accountable." Bryant's face darkened, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "And you think this is accountability? Dragging the entire department through the mud? You've made us all look like a bunch of racists." Jason didn't back down. "I'm not responsible for the actions of those officers, and I'm not responsible for the culture that allowed it to happen. That's on us. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, the public will. And that's exactly what's happening now." One of the other officers, a lieutenant named Garcia, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You think you can just come in here and fix everything? You're a captain, Thompson, not a crusader. This department doesn't need saving." Jason turned to Garcia, his voice firm. "I'm not trying to save the department, Lieutenant. I'm trying to save the people we're supposed to protect. That's our job, isn't it?" Garcia scoffed, crossing his arms. "Your job is to follow orders and maintain discipline, not to go running to the press every time something doesn't go your way." Jason shook his head, his frustration building. "This isn't about following orders. It's about doing what's right. If we can't police ourselves, then we have no business policing this community." Chief Bryant sighed, rubbing his temples as if Jason's words were giving him a headache. "Look, Thompson, I get it. You're upset. But this—" He waved his hand toward a copy of the Millwood Gazette lying on his desk. "This is going to make your life hell. You've put a target on your back, and not just from the department. People out there are pissed. The officers you threw under the bus aren't going to take this lying down." Jason knew Bryant was right. The backlash wasn't just coming from within the department. Since the article had been published, there had been a flurry of activity on social media and in the local press. Some were calling for a complete overhaul of the police force, while others, mostly those sympathetic to the officers involved, were accusing Jason of betraying his brothers in blue. The divide was growing, and it was only going to get worse. "I'm prepared for that," Jason said, his voice resolute. "But I won't regret doing what's right." Bryant leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You better be sure about that, Thompson, because once this investigation gets going, there's no telling where it will lead. You might not like what you find." Jason stood, his heart hammering in his chest, but his resolve unshaken. "I'm not afraid of the truth, Chief. I'm afraid of what happens if we keep ignoring it." Without waiting for a response, Jason turned and left the office. He knew this was only the beginning. The investigation would dig up more than just the events of that night in the park. It would expose the corruption, the prejudice, the toxic culture that had been festering in the Millwood Police Department for years. And when it did, there would be no going back. That evening, Jason returned home to find Emma sitting on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for some sense of peace. She looked up when she saw him approach, a faint smile on her lips, but Jason could see the worry in her eyes. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice soft. Jason sat beside her, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. "It went about as well as I expected," he admitted. "Bryant's pissed. The department's pissed. Everyone's pissed." Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "And how are you holding up?" Jason looked out at the street, the quiet neighborhood bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He thought about everything that had happened, about the struggle, the resistance, the threats. But then he thought about the people who had reached out after the article was published. The messages of support, the stories of others who had experienced the same kind of mistreatment and had felt powerless to do anything about it. "I'm okay," Jason said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "It's hard, but I know I'm doing the right thing." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm proud of you, Jay. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Jason closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words sink in. He didn't know what the future held, whether he would win this fight or be crushed by it. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Jason knew that the hardest part was still to come. The investigation would begin in earnest, and with it would come the real battle, a battle for the soul of the department, for justice, for accountability. And Jason was ready. The final battle for justice. As the investigation intensified and the truth about the Millwood Police Department was laid bare, Jason found himself in the center of a firestorm. The public outrage continued to grow, and the pressure on the department to make significant changes was relentless. Jason had hoped for this. He had wanted the system to be held accountable, but he couldn't have predicted how personally dangerous this fight would become. Every day at the station was now a battleground. He could feel the eyes on him wherever he went. Some officers whispered as he passed, others outright ignored him, and a few even stared him down with open contempt. The weight of the department's fractured loyalty hung over everything, and Jason could feel it crushing down on him. There was no middle ground left. You were either on the side of reform, or you were entrenched in the toxic culture that had plagued the department for decades. Detective Vaughn had become one of Jason's few allies in the station, and they often found themselves strategizing late into the evening, going over the details of the investigation and planning their next steps. Vaughn, always sharp and fearless, had become indispensable to Jason. Without her, he wasn't sure how he would have navigated the internal warfare that was now his everyday reality. But outside the station, things were even more chaotic. The protests had continued to grow, with hundreds of people gathering outside the police headquarters daily. They were no longer just demanding accountability for the night in the park. They were calling for a complete overhaul of the department. Jason watched from the windows of his office as waves of protesters chanted slogans of justice, holding up signs that bore messages like "No justice, no peace," and "End police brutality." While the protests were mostly peaceful, the presence of counter-protesters had made the situation volatile. Every day, tensions flared as pro-police groups clashed with those demanding reform. Jason had seen the footage of these confrontations. Angry, embittered men shouting at young activists, tempers fraying at the edges of civility. It was only a matter of time before something broke. The breaking point came one Thursday afternoon. Jason had just finished a meeting with Vaughn when an emergency alert went out across the station. Protesters had clashed with counter-protesters, and the scene had erupted into violence. The area in front of the station had turned into chaos. Riot police were already being deployed. As Jason rushed to the front of the building, the scene that greeted him was far worse than he had imagined. Hundreds of people were packed together, their faces twisted with anger and fear. Protesters and counter-protesters were pushing and shoving, screaming in each other's faces, while riot police tried to force the crowds apart. The air was thick with the smell of smoke from a small fire that had been started near the steps of the station. It was pandemonium. Jason pushed his way through the crowd, Vaughn close behind him. As they tried to assess the situation, the shouts of the crowd were deafening. But amid the noise, Jason could hear a familiar voice, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. It was Horton. The former sergeant, who had been suspended pending the investigation, was standing at the front of the counter-protesters, his face red with fury as he shouted into a megaphone. "This is our city," Horton roared. "We protect it. Not these criminals, not these agitators. We will not let them destroy what we've built." Jason's stomach churned as he watched Horton rile up the crowd. Horton had always been dangerous, but now, stripped of his badge and facing public disgrace, he was unpredictable. The sight of him there, leading the charge against the protesters, was enough to set Jason's nerves on edge. "We have to stop this before someone gets seriously hurt," Vaughn said, her voice tense as she scanned the crowd. Jason nodded, pushing forward through the mass of bodies. He had to get closer, had to find a way to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. But as he neared the center of the chaos, he realized just how dire things had become. Horton's followers were growing more aggressive by the second, and the protesters, fed up with the brutality they had faced for years, were ready to fight back. Suddenly, a bottle flew through the air, crashing against the pavement just feet from where Jason stood. The sound of glass shattering seemed to set off a chain reaction, and before Jason could react, the crowd surged forward. He could see people being pushed and shoved, fists flying, and the riot police moving in with shields raised. Jason tried to push forward, but the tide of the crowd was too strong. Vaughn grabbed his arm, pulling him back before they were swallowed by the chaos. "We need to fall back," Vaughn shouted over the noise. "This is out of control." Jason hesitated. Every fiber of his being wanted to charge into the fray, to pull Horton off his makeshift stage, and stop this madness. But he knew Vaughn was right. The situation had escalated beyond anything they could contain on their own. As they retreated to the steps of the station, Jason spotted something that made his blood run cold. At the far edge of the crowd, standing with a group of counter-protesters, was Emma. She was watching the scene unfold with a look of horror on her face, her eyes wide as she took in the violence around her. Jason's heart leaped into his throat. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had promised him she would stay home, far away from the protests. But now, here she was, in the middle of the chaos. Without thinking, Jason broke away from Vaughn, pushing through the crowd toward Emma. His heart pounded in his chest as he shoved people aside, desperate to reach her before things got worse. "Emma," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Emma, get out of here." But Emma didn't hear him. She was too focused on the scene unfolding before her, the violence, the anger, the clash between two worlds that had collided in the worst possible way. Just as Jason reached her, a flash of movement caught his eye. Horton, still shouting into his megaphone, had spotted Emma in the crowd. His face twisted into a snarl, and for a brief moment, Jason saw the full depth of Horton's hatred. Horton dropped the megaphone and began pushing through the crowd, heading straight for Emma. Jason's heart raced. He had to stop Horton. He had to get Emma out of there before it was too late. "Emma, run," Jason shouted, grabbing her arm. Emma turned just as Horton reached them, his fists clenched and his face contorted with rage. "You think you can tear this department apart?" Horton bellowed, his voice filled with venom. "You think you can turn this city against us?" Jason stepped between Horton and Emma, his body tense with adrenaline. "This isn't about you, Horton. This is about justice." Horton's eyes blazed with fury. "Justice? You don't know the first thing about justice. You're a traitor, a disgrace." Jason held his ground, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You don't scare me, Horton. This ends now." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the weight of years of animosity hanging between them. Jason could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken threat of violence just waiting to erupt. But then, something unexpected happened. One of Horton's followers, emboldened by the chaos and Horton's aggression, lunged forward, swinging a metal pipe at Jason's head. Jason saw it coming at the last second, ducking just in time to avoid the blow. The pipe swung through the air, missing him by inches, but the force of the swing knocked Jason off balance. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his footing. Emma screamed, reaching for Jason as he fell, but the momentum of the crowd carried them apart. Jason hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of him as he struggled to get up. Before he could move, the crowd surged forward, trampling over him in a wave of bodies. He felt the weight of people pressing down on him, the heat of the crowd suffocating as he fought to breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The riot police had moved in, forcing the crowds apart, and Jason was pulled to his feet by Vaughn. His body ached, his lungs burned, but his eyes searched desperately for Emma. He spotted her just a few feet away, her eyes wide with fear but unharmed. Relief flooded through him as he stumbled toward her, pulling her into his arms. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm okay." Jason held her tightly, his heart still racing as the weight of everything that had just happened sank in. They had come so close to losing everything, to losing each other, but they had survived. In the weeks that followed, the investigation concluded, and the findings were damning. Horton and several other high-ranking officers were indicted on charges of misconduct, excessive force, and civil rights violations. The department was placed under federal oversight, and a new police chief was brought in to lead the long-overdue reforms. Jason knew that the battle for justice was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The system was changing, slowly but surely, and he had played a part in making that happen. Emma stood by his side through it all, her unwavering support giving him the strength to keep going, even when the fight seemed impossible. Together, they had faced down the darkness, and they had emerged on the other side, stronger than ever. As Jason looked out over the city from the steps of the police station, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. Because sometimes fighting for what's right means standing up against everything, even when the odds are stacked against you.